Archaeology is full of surprises as we're constantly unearthing artifacts that teach us more about past civilizations, their cultures, beliefs, and everyday way of life. But some archaeological digs hold more questions than answers, as they seem to skew everything we thought we knew about certain areas of our planet. And some of these mysteries may never yield the answers that we're looking for. Number 5. One of the first images that most of us think of when it comes to archaeology is an Egyptian mummy that has been unearthed somewhere in Egypt. These discoveries often carry a fair deal of mystery with them, not to mention a lot of superstition. In days of old, mummies were brought to the Western world in massive amounts after they were discovered, and they were then put on display for the public to see. But they weren't just a source of wonderment and education. Mummies were also used in medicine, known as mumia in the Western world, as they were believed to contain a cure-all for all kinds of ailments and diseases. It was thought to be useful against seizures, blood clots, lethargy, and a range of neurological problems, just to mention a few. When this fad eventually faded away, mummies were shipped to private homes of the Victorian affluent, who would hold unwrapping parties to entertain their guests. Thanks to this kind of naivety, many mummies were destroyed without ever being inspected by historians, and we will never have the opportunity to learn more about them. But then there are those mummies who are unearthed and well preserved, but we still have very little information about who they were, how they lost their lives, or what their social standing may have been. One such mummy that has kept scientists baffled for over a century since its discovery is known as Unknown Man E, also sometimes referred to as the Screaming Mummy. One of the few things known about it is that he was a male who was around 19 years old when he was buried. The discovery was made in 1886 when a group of grave robbers were apprehended and found to be in possession of an archaeological find that would eventually become known as the Royal Cache of Deir el-Bahari. The cache included the mummified remains of over 50 people who were of royal lineage and over 6,000 other Egyptian artifacts. Among the mummies found in their possession were Ramses II and III, as well as Hatshepsut. The head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service took possession of the mummies, and he immediately realized that there was something strange about Unknown Man E, and he performed the unwrapping in 1886. When mummies are discovered, they're usually wrapped in many layers of linen, each containing trinkets or idols that were believed to accompany them to the afterlife. But Unknown Man E was wrapped in sheepskin instead. This was only done to people who were thought to be impure or who had committed an act so disgraceful that they were thought to be undeserving of a proper burial. This is a very unusual practice, but even more curious is what was found inside of the mummy. Usually, the only organ left inside the mummy before burial is the heart, which was believed to contain a person's intelligence. But with Unknown Man E, things were a little different. He was found to still contain most of his organs, including his brain, which would suggest that he was embalmed and buried in a hurry, though it isn't known why this would have been done. But the mystery only deepened when his coffin was inspected. Normally, when a mummy was buried, they would be found inside coffins that contained intricate carvings and hieroglyphs that told their story, including where they were from and what their social standing was. But this wasn't the case with Unknown Man E. His coffin, although made of expensive cedar wood, contained no hieroglyphs, and the only clue was the crossed arms that were carved onto the top of the coffin, which only became popular during the 19th dynasty, giving us some indication of when he lost his life. The fact that his coffin was undecorated is very unusual, since these symbols were usually carved into the coffin to ensure the deceased person's journey to the afterlife. The question remains why this was not done for the Screaming Mummy. Furthermore, it would seem that his coffin was not even built to fit his proportions, since it was found that alterations had to be made to the coffin just to fit him inside. But this is all very enigmatic, since he also wore gold earrings, something that held a very high status, possibly even one of royalty, though the earrings have since gone missing. Inside the coffin were 2 canes that were woven out of reeds. This led to a belief that the mummy may have been connected to King Tut, since his treasurer, who was called Maya, was portrayed as having been buried with 2 similar canes, though the canes have since been lost as well and their current location remains unknown. Upon further inspection, it was thought that Unknown Man E's hands and legs had been tied together before he was buried, But this is now thought to have been a misunderstanding, and it's now believed that the bandages that were tied around these areas were merely knotted too tightly, resulting in marks that were mistakenly attributed to restraints. But one of the mummy's most distinctive features is the horrified expression on his face, which resulted in the moniker the Screaming Mummy. This, coupled with the other evidence that was found in the coffin, or lack thereof, has given birth to the theory that he was buried while he was still alive, since this was done to those who committed an unforgivable crime. As for the mummy's identity, there have been many theories, including one that suggests he was a foreign prince who was slated to marry King Tut's wife after he passed away. But before he could do so, he mysteriously disappeared, and it's thought that he had his life taken near the Egyptian border. Another prevailing theory is that he was improperly preserved because he passed away in a foreign country where preservation methods weren't the norm. However, efforts were made to mummify him before sending his remains back to Egypt. Some research suggests that Unknown Man E was, in fact, the son of Ramses III. If this theory is true, he and his mother were plotting to do away with Ramses III, but their plot was discovered and they lost their lives. But many scholars still believe that the mummy's identity is yet to be confirmed, since the evidence supports many other theories. It's easy to see why Unknown Man E is considered to be one of the most enigmatic mummies ever discovered, and his true identity, along with his life story, may remain an archaeological mystery that we will never be able to solve. Number 4. Sometimes, the importance of an archaeological site is only recognized after its discovery, when a significant artifact or feature is unearthed, and in many cases, these sites have been ruined by people living in the area who had no idea what was hiding underfoot. This is the case with a mound site known as Poverty Point, which is situated in Louisiana. Although the site was discovered in the 1830s and excavated multiple times since 1913, it was only in the 1950s that it was identified as a man-made structure. Because its significance wasn't known to local people, the site was repeatedly plowed by farmers in order to grow their crops, and it's believed that some damage was done to the site during that time. Poverty Point is now understood to have been inhabited by a Native American community more than 3 centuries ago, though the name of their tribe remains unknown today, as does the method by which they created these impressive mounds. What we do know is that they took a very long time to create, more than 5,000 years to be exact. But it wasn't a constant construction project, since there were long periods during which no work was done. The first of these inactive periods lasted for a century, from 2700 BC to 1700 BC, while the second lasted for 500 years between 1200 BC and 500 BC. The mounds were, however, still inhabited by local people, but construction wasn't continued during these time periods. This is one of the Poverty Point's mysteries that are yet to be solved. No one is sure why there were such long periods of inactivity, but even more baffling is the reason behind the mound's creation, as well as the long periods during which construction was done at a near fever-pitch pace. Because of the exact shapes used during its construction, historians theorized that the mound's inhabitants believed that geometry had sacred properties which could be directed via certain shapes that were incorporated into the mound. The site is made up of a series of ridges in a concentric circle shape, and it's believed that these ridges contained the houses in which the local people lived. And at its center lay a plaza that contained yet another mound that's believed to have been used during ceremonies. When these ceremonies were performed, energy from the houses was directed towards the central plaza, but the opposite was also thought to be true, and that energy from the plaza could be directed back toward the houses. This energy is then thought to have been stored in 6 external mounds, named A through F, which are located around the outside of the structure. Although the ridges are in a distinct C shape today, it's believed that they were full circles at one point, and that a section of the circles were flooded by a nearby river. However, some scholars believe that the site was actually built as a square, due to the location of some of the external mounds. The first of these external mounds, known as Mound A, may have been considered one of the more important at the time, and it's believed that it was originally built in the shape of some type of bird. Historians believe that Mound A served as the first energy repository since it's the tallest, standing an impressive 72 feet high, and that its construction only took around 3 months to complete. It may also have been used in conjunction with Mound C, which was built sometime later when a high amount of energy was required during a ritual or ceremony. The other mounds are less impressive, with B standing 21 feet tall, C at 6.5 feet, D at only 4 feet. E reaches 13 feet and F is just 5 feet tall. These are, however, not the only mounds attributed to the site, since 2 more were discovered nearby. They were named Jackson Mound and Motley Mound respectively. Jackson Mound unfortunately suffered a lot of damage after its discovery. The owner of the land became disgruntled that it was made into an archaeological site and took it upon himself to inflict as much damage as he could. Another mystery that is yet to be unraveled is why there's no evidence of plant fossils near the mound, since the Mississippi Valley is known to be extremely fertile and it would have been the perfect location to grow crops. Since it's known that the inhabitants foraged for grapes, nuts, and persimmons, one would think that they could grow their own, but this doesn't seem to have been the case. Some people believe that it's because they simply didn't need to, since the mound was located along a well-known trade route. This could mean that they simply traded for any provisions they needed, including more raw materials that could be used to continue the construction of the mound. This is evidenced by nearly 80 tons of rock at the site that was found to have originated over 800 miles away. This stone would not only have been used during construction, but also in the creation of spearheads and other weapons, as well as ceremonial pieces that they would have seen as sacred. Thanks to other finds at the site, including canoes and fishing nets, we know that they did make use of the river to find food. Added to this discovery were clay and stone figures that resemble owls and human figures, though it isn't known whether they were spiritually significant or if they were merely created as pieces of art. The biggest mystery that surrounds Poverty Point, though, is why it was abandoned. Living in such a fertile valley would have been the perfect scenario for a developing community, and yet they chose to leave. Some theories suggest that flooding became an issue, as is evident from the circles that have been engulfed by the nearby river, or that overpopulation may have forced them to seek a different area to live in. But for now, all we have is conjecture, and a mystery that may never yield any answers. Number 3. When we think of a bustling metropolis, we usually imagine a city like New York or London. But many people are surprised when they learn about Cahokia, a city that existed long before these famous cities. And at the time, it was the largest city that could be found north of Mexico. Situated in modern-day Illinois and just east of St. Louis, Cahokia was home to more than 15,000 people, which at the time was remarkable. But this didn't account for everyone that flocked to the city, as some people lived on its outskirts, and it's believed that up to 30,000 people lived in the surrounding areas, drawn here by the promise of a better, easier life. Cahokia is so named after the people who were living in the area when it was discovered in the 1600s by French explorers. The city was built by a group of people known as the Mississippians, which were made up of Native Americans who lived in the eastern United States at the time. But it wasn't just occupied by locals. Remains have been uncovered at the site that suggest people from far and wide flocked to the city, further confirming that it was considered a modern and developing city that could sustain the lives of thousands of people, and it's believed that this never changed until the city's eventual abandonment. And this is the mystery of Cahokia. No one is certain why it was abandoned, as there's been no evidence found that there was either war or conflict of any kind. And archaeologists were surprised when they were able to find only a small amount of arrowheads buried in the soil. It's almost certain that hunger and poverty weren't the cause either, since the city was thriving and was able to sustain those that lived there. Archaeological digs did, however, reveal mass graves that were dug in one of the mounds at the site, but it's thought that these remains belonged mostly to young women who were offered as sacrifices. One archaeologist believes that the city may have been under threat from an outside force, since it was rebuilt a number of times between its creation and 1275. At one time, it was thought that the city's abandonment may have been due to floods in the area that were brought about by deforestation. The theory was that the people of the city cut down too many trees during construction projects, and that this led to floods and landslides that eventually drove them away. But scholars now believe that the reason for the mass exodus of people is likely far more complicated, and could include a number of factors including disease, political instability, or religious reasons. The largest mound that ever existed in Cahokia is known as Monk's Mound. It's so named after French Trappist monks who looked after the site during the 1800s, and it's believed that this was the area where important issues were discussed by the city's spiritual and political leaders. Evidence was found that there was a structure that existed on top of Monk's Mound at some point, and it's thought that this would have been home to the city's chief, or possibly a temple where people could worship. But Monk's Mound is only one of over 120 other mounds that were built in the city and the surrounding area. This means that massive amounts of soil had to be moved by hand, and it's believed that this was done with the use of woven baskets. And considering that it would require the movement of over 55 million cubic feet of soil, it would have taken some time and effort to say the least. Those who lived outside the city built small houses measuring around 15 by 12 feet. These frames of these houses were constructed from wooden poles, and the walls consisted of woven mats that were suspended from the poles. The houses were then finished off with thatched roofing. As for the city center, it was surrounded by a wooden fence that encircled the entire area, which is a staggering 2 miles in circumference, something that would have been quite a feat at the time, and it would have required a lot of wood from the surrounding area. When it came to defending the city, something that's thought to have never been required, evidence was found that they built watchtowers and some of the mounds in the area in preparation for any conflict that may come their way. Then there's an area known as Woodhenge, which is not unique to Cahokia, since similar structures have been found in other areas that were inhabited by the Mississippian people. It consists of a circle of wooden poles that have been planted vertically. It's believed that this was used to calculate the summer and winter solstices, as well as both the equinoxes. But there isn't just one of these structures, as a further 4 have been discovered. Interestingly, they contain 24, 28, 36, and 60 posts respectively, and the 5th is thought to have contained 72 poles. However, it's not been fully excavated as of yet. There are some scholars who don't believe that these structures were used as calendars, and they suggest instead that they were used in designing the layout of the city. There are also some who believe that it had some sort of religious significance, but none of these theories have been proven beyond doubt. There are, of course, a number of artifacts that have been unearthed at Cahokia, including expected arrowheads, a small amount of pottery, blades and jewelry made from seashells that were found to have come from as far away as the Atlantic Ocean. Among the more interesting finds are tattoo kits, games that were played with balls, hoops, pins, and rings, as well as games that are thought to have been connected to gambling. At the base of the mounds, archaeologists uncovered a small copper forge that may have been used in creating jewelry, tools, and pieces of decorative art. But the most intriguing of all these finds is a stone tablet known as the Birdman tablet. The front of this tablet contains a depiction of a human with wings like those of a bird. On the back, it contains a series of diagonal lines that look very similar to snakeskin. It's believed that the tablet may have been a representation of the 3 worlds that the city's inhabitants believed in, namely heaven, which is represented by the wings, earth, represented by the man, and the underworld, represented by a snake. It's an area that warrants many more years of study, and if we're lucky, we may find more answers connected to this enigmatic city, and the people who lived within its wooden walls. The question remains whether we will ever uncover the truth behind the city's abandonment. Whether this was brought about by an external force, such as climate change, or from inside the city, for example, religious instability, remains to be seen. Number 2. Archaeological digs can turn up some very strange artifacts that no one could have foreseen, including out-of-place artifacts such as footprints on the ceiling of a cave, crucible steel swords from a time when their manufacturing should have been impossible, and fossils of animals in areas where they shouldn't be. Then, in 2015, archaeologists from France's National Institute for Preventative Archaeological Research had been excavating the convent of the Jacobins when they found a remarkable discovery that they could not have expected when they found over 800 coffins buried on the property. Underneath the convent, they found a coffin containing the remains of Louise de Quengo, and when the vessel was opened, they were surprised to find that she had been remarkably well preserved, including the clothes that she was wearing. But the most surprising discovery was found in the coffin next to her. In a lead case in the shape of a heart, they found the embalmed heart of her husband, a practice that was not uncommon at the time. The lead casing contained an inscription on the outside that read, "This is the heart of Toussaint de Paria, whose body lies at the Savior near Cathay in the convent of Discalced Carmelites, that he founded and died on the 30th of August, 1649. They then learned more about Louise, who was found to have been in her mid-60s when she passed away in 1656. She and Perrien had been married, and when she was buried, she was wearing leather shoes with cork soles, a woolen dress, a bonnet, and a cape, which are thought to be religious clothing. It's believed that Louise had an affluent life since she was associated with royalty. But after her husband passed away, she moved away to live in the convent where she was eventually buried with his heart beside her. When her lead coffin was opened, researchers expected to find someone buried in expensive clothing, with jewelry and other personal items. But this wasn't the case, and the only other item found in the coffin was a crucifix that had been placed in Louise's hands. The clothes were removed from the coffin and were expertly restored so that they could be put on display. Louise's remains were then buried in Rennes. Not only was it then discovered that her husband's heart had been removed by someone with extensive surgical knowledge, but they also performed an autopsy on Louise's remains to see what they could learn. They found that she'd been suffering quite badly from kidney stones and lung adhesions, suggesting that she had suffered from lung disease at one point, but she likely recovered, since adhesions are formed during the healing process of internal organs. But it wasn't just Perrien's heart that was found during the excavation. 4 more lead containers were unearthed, each containing an embalmed heart. All of the hearts belonged to upper-class people whose partners were buried at the convent. Archaeologists believe that this was a romantic gesture undertaken by the deceased loved ones who wanted to keep a vital part of their partner with them, even after they themselves had passed away. It's remarkable to think that we're able to study the actual heart of a person who passed away over 400 years ago, and that we can learn from these discoveries so many years later. They found that the oldest of the hearts dated to around 1584, while the youngest was embalmed in 1655. Once the hearts were removed from their casings, they found that 4 of the hearts had been surprisingly well preserved, and researchers used an MRI machine to scan the organs to inspect them for any information that they could gather about their owners. But the embalming material that was used made this impossible, and they had to come up with an alternative plan. Researchers decided to clean the hearts, removing any of the embalming material that remained, and then did more scans to see what they could learn. Finally, they were able to study the hearts fully, as they were able to inspect each of the chambers, valves, and arteries. But they decided to go one step further, and the hearts were rehydrated, which then allowed them to also inspect the different hearts' muscles, with not only the MRI machine, but also through dissection and histology, which examines biological structures and how they function. But only one of the hearts was found to be completely healthy, and one other, which belonged to a woman, had been improperly preserved, causing it to decay to the point where it could no longer be useful during their examinations. The other 3 hearts all showed signs of heart disease, specifically cholesterol and fat buildup in the arteries. These materials are collectively known as plaque and can easily prove to be fatal if not treated properly. This plaque builds up over time and eventually hardens, causing a blockage in the arteries that restricts flow, which in many cases leads to a stroke or heart attack, and very often results in the person passing away. Researchers were intrigued to learn that the heart disease isn't just a modern health issue, since these people from hundreds of years ago also suffered from the same symptoms that modern humans do today. But there's another known instance where an embalmed heart was discovered during an archaeological dig. During an excavation in Normandy, researchers found a rectangular lead box containing the heart of Richard the Lionheart, who was King of England between 1189 and 1199. It was common practice in those days to have different parts of the body buried separately, and his body was buried in Chaillot, where he passed away after he was wounded during a battle. Not much of the heart remained, and in fact, researchers only had a small amount of powder to work with. But they found that the heart had been wrapped in linen of the best quality after it had been treated with flowers, herbs, and lime. Once the remains of the heart had been thoroughly inspected, it was reburied in Edward's coffin. It's believed that the practice of having one's heart embalmed and sent to a loved one was most popular during the 12th and 13th centuries. But it's also known to date back as far as the Middle Ages, during the time of Crusades when it was common for people to pass away while they were far from their homes. Their bodies would have then been sent back home after the organs had been removed, and in many instances, their heart would have been placed in a lead or ivory box containing herbs that would mask any unpleasant odors that may result from decomposition. During the later period, though, it was common for members of royalty to have this done, but it wasn't reserved just for the rich, as poets were also known to have had their hearts embalmed, likely because they were often associated with romantic imagery. Number 1. We've already looked at 2 historical sites that contain mysterious mounds built by Native Americans a very long time ago, including their purpose and the techniques that were used during their construction. But one mound that is located in southern Ohio is even more mysterious, as we have no idea who it was built by or what its purpose would have been at the time of its construction. This mound is known as the Great Serpent Mound, and it's steeped in mystery. The mound is situated at the site of a meteor crash that is thought to have occurred over 300 million years ago, in what is now Adams County in Ohio. The crash resulted in a crater that measured around 5 miles in diameter, and at some point, someone decided to create the Great Serpent Mound in that same spot. The mound isn't as high as some of the more impressive ones that have been discovered, as it measures just 1 foot in some areas, and at its highest, it reaches about 3 feet high. But it's by no means a small mound, as it stretches for about 1,300 feet in a serpentine pattern. Researchers have theorized that the mound may have been a tribute to snakes, since many native cultures from America believed that these creatures had powers beyond our understanding. These powers were also attributed to other animals, such as lizards, certain birds like the raven, wolves, and even certain plants that they believed would give them the ability to morph into an animal. And it's easy to see why they would have put this forward as a theory, since the mound seems to have been constructed with spiritual elements in mind. The serpent's tail was built facing west, while the head faces east, possibly representing the rise and setting of the sun. Between the 2 ends, the mounds undulate like a snake, with 7 mounds that were constructed in a crescent shape. But it's the head of the snake that's caused a lot of discussion, and on occasion, heated arguments between researchers and scientists. It's the shape of the head that has caused the most controversy, since it's oval-shaped and many people have made their own interpretations as to what it may represent. Some scholars believe that it's supposed to depict a toad that's about to be eaten by the serpent, which has its jaws open in readiness for the attack. But others theorize that it's actually supposed to represent a massive eye that is always watching and keeping a lookout on the surrounding area as protection. Others think that it's a depiction of a hollow egg, possibly portraying an element of fertility. But speculation about the head of the serpent doesn't end there. Some people don't think that it's an egg or a toad at all, but that the oval shape represents the sun. Since the snake has its jaws wide open, it's thought that it may be about to swallow the sun. They theorize that if this is indeed the case, the mound may have been constructed as a representation, or perhaps even a tribute to a solar eclipse that was witnessed in the area at the time. But all of these theories are rather specific, and some researchers think that there may be a more ambiguous meaning to the mound. Some have speculated that it may include some, if not all, the knowledge that this culture had about the night sky, and that they thought celestial bodies represented. Since Halley's Comet is known to have been visible in the sky in 1066, some people think that they noticed it in the sky, assumed that it had some spiritual meaning, and then decided to construct the mound as a tribute to an event that may have seemed supernatural to their eyes. It's also possible that the mound served a practical function instead of a spiritual one, or maybe both. It's been suggested that the mound's shape is similar to the northern sky constellation, known as Draco. This constellation's pole star is thought by some to correspond to the area where the mound curves for the first time behind the head. And if this is indeed the case, it would have been possible to use this alignment to find true north. In other words, it may have been used as a compass of sorts. Then there's the theory that the mound isn't supposed to represent a snake at all. Some researchers think what most people see as an open jaw is actually an appendage, such as a leg, and this would mean that the mound is actually a tribute to a lizard or a similar creature that was considered sacred. But the prevailing theory is that it's meant to look like a snake, since it's well known that people who lived in this valley in Ohio often used copper sheets to create similar, more decorative and intricate serpentine figures. But all of this is mere speculation, and no one has been able to ascertain for certain why the mound was constructed. There are, of course, many theories that have been put forward. Despite the lack of evidence at the site, some scholars believe that the mound has something to do with the passage of time, and that it may be an ancient form of calendar, since the serpent's tail points to the sunrise at winter solstice, and the head points at the summer solstice's sunset. It may be that this was a way for this culture to determine the seasons. This would have been especially helpful during periods when the planting and harvesting of crops needed to be done at the right time. But the rest of the Serpent Mound has also been speculated over. The undulating body of snakes could possibly represent the phases of the moon, which may have been another important aspect of the daily lives of people who lived in the area at the time. Another theory suggests that they align with the winter and summer solstices, as well as the summer and winter equinoxes. The number of theories concerning the Great Serpent Mound is a testament to how little we know about certain periods in history, and more accurately, certain areas during certain periods. This is evidenced by the fact that we aren't even sure who constructed the mound. The theory that's supported by most researchers is that people who lived in the area between 1000 and 1650 CE were responsible for its construction. One other, more ambiguous theory is that it wasn't built by one single set of inhabitants, but rather it was expanded upon by different groups of people that lived in the area during different times throughout history. But as with so many archaeological mysteries, we aren't sure if we'll ever be able to gather more information on the strange mound and its true purpose. One thing that is certain, however, is that it's an impressive creation, considering the limited resources that ancient cultures had to work with. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next